So I just want to give everyone a second to take a breath, and I'm going to go ahead and broadcast this.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
Here we go.
Hello, everyone. I guess we are still waiting for Willie Cole to join us. He's had a few glitches as these things happen. So we're going to give him another minute or so to join us, and then we'll all move on.
There he is.
There's our wonderful Willie. Hi, Willie. Welcome.
Thank you.
First of all, good afternoon. And for those of you, most of you should know me, those of you who've come in from the Instagram vector, I'm Barrister Booth, and I'm the principal curator of the Petrucci Family Foundation collection of African American art. And I want to thank you very much for joining us for our inaugural artist Shuga Wata salon. This is, how can I say this? This is an unprecedented time in human history, and we're all called upon right now to see better, to do better, and to be better if we're going to ever come together, as the proto-rapper Gil Scott-Heron says. If we're going to come to peace within ourselves, we all must elect these troubling times of a pandemic and the nation responding to brutality, that I think it's an important thing to put us and mark us in our place right now in our time, and that is that we must all work for peace, and that even though we're globally on pause because of the pandemic and because of more brazen attack on Black bodies, we must work for peace individually and collectively. And so, most important, besides thanking you for being here, I implore you all to stay safe and stay strong. We will get through this. All right, first, I must introduce on the screen our collections manager, Claudia Volpe, who's recently joined our PFF team and is fully committed to our mission. Second, there are so many friends and partnering institutions and supporters here in our Zoom audience today, and I just want to take a second to thank you very much for being present. It's your support and your belief in what we're doing and our mission that keeps us excited on a day-to-day level, and I'm sure Claudia can confirm that. And most important, I want to extend our heartfelt thanks to Jim Petrucci, who's seriously been dedicated to social justice long before he tasked me and us to put together this collection. So thank you, Jim. Thank you for supporting and funding this initiative. So onward with all the good we can do. In fact, a little bit of a side note, we hadn't intended to produce our initial or inaugural salon until next week, but given the events as they are in America and around the globe, we felt the urgency to put together this stellar panel of artists and friends to talk about the concept of radical forgiveness at the personal, at the larger cultural level, and through the lens of their own artwork. Our three esteemed artists today are Delita Martin, Charles Edward Williams, and of course, Willie Cole. I am friends with all three of these wonderful individuals in special ways, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful. We are deeply, deeply grateful for their participation today. As I said a moment ago, our topic is radical forgiveness. And I'm not going to lock us into a conceptual definition or lock you into a structure of what that means. Instead, I'll let each artist speak briefly and explain or engage that concept as it pertains to them individually, to their work, to their vision, and to how they place themselves in the world as it is right now. Our history is a diverse community of color, and as citizens of this nation, could never have been as dynamic were it not for resilience and for determination born of radical forgiveness. So with all that said, and with more people joining us, I want to introduce our first speaker, who's Charles Edward Williams. He's an exemplary figurative and landscape painter, currently residing in Greensboro, Charles, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Yep. Charles, welcome. If you'd be so kind, please begin.
Hey guys. Hey. I wanted to start out kind of like in a timeline. So in 2016, I was in grad school, and I started looking at, some of the police brutalities that were going on, and just really trying to wrap my mind around why this is happening. And so it led me to look into, historical events and past moments. And from that led me to look inward, to look at some of my own traumatic events that led me to want to talk about it and want to make art about it. So one of the things that, I hid for a very, very long time was that I was abused for 13 years. I grew up in a conservative Christian home, but my mother wanted to keep it under the rug, as they say in the South, of what was going on. And so my father, being a military man, he had PTSD, and he was dealing with a family dynamic that he wasn't aware of. And so, he would come home from work, cut all the lights off, and we would have to, my brothers and I, we would have to tiptoe around our house to get things or to eat, to do things. And he didn't really know how to manage his PTSD. And so if we did something that rattled him or shook him, he would take whatever he could find and abuse us and hit us. So for his, sometimes, for his pleasure, he would, build things, kind of fix things up around the house, cabinets, and lay down flooring. And we would have to help him. And again, if we weren't accurate in getting him these things, if we weren't being fast enough, my father would, utilize military tactics of choking us out. And, so I remember being hit by a hammer. I remember being choked out. I remember watching and my brother, literally break his arm. And so these things continue for about 13 years. And every time I talk about it, I my palms start sweating and I get a little nervous about it. And because it still has it's something that I've wrestled with, and I still have nightmares about currently, that, I'm working through. I remember learning how to run, literally because my father would make my older brother chase me, and he would tell him, if you don't get him back, if you don't bring him back, literally, I'm gonna hurt you. So I learned how to run fast. I learned how to climb trees, and it was my older brother's objective to get me. So he would bring me back, and once he got me back to my father, my older brother was forced to hold my two legs in the air. My father held, my left arm, and my father would either take a dogwood tree limb that he shaved and sharpened while my brother was getting me to use on me, or use a leather belt to literally whip me in the air. So it would be as I'm a human hammock, to where I couldn't run. And then afterwards he would, jack me up and shove me against the wall. And, he would pick his nose and blow his nose in my shirt and wipe them all over my face. And the thing is, for me, is that I never could have understood, if you tell somebody you love them, why would you do these hurtful things? And so, again, the experiences of that was from looking inward, was from me thinking about the brutality that was going on in America, and the mistreatment. And I went to therapy and gone through that. And I said, you know what, this is something that needs to be shared. And there's countless stories that I could tell of abuse, but I posed the question, how many other kids or how many other people have gone through this abuse, dealt with this, and has continued this cycle? And so what I learned from talking to my parents about it and other family members is that they knew about this, and this was a generational curse. So after 13 years, I watched my father literally give his life to Christ. I was, my brother and I, we were at my grandmother's house, and I was watching WCW wrestling. Well, we both were. My father was sleeping behind me, and I looked back, and literally his eyes was rolled back in his head, and he was beating on the couch and saying, "I will not preach your word." I got up and ran to go get my grandmother, and my grandmother and I, we stood in the doorway watching him with his eyes rolled back in his head and literally saying, "I will not preach your word," and him beating on the couch. And this lasted for 15 minutes. And then when he woke up, he looked straight at us, and there was this, I never really saw my father smile, but this was the first time that I saw him smile with like a kid, glowing. And afterwards he said, "I will do your work." And shortly after, weeks later, he got baptized and gave his life to Christ. And the abuse stopped. Me, I wasn't a believer of that, and I just wanted to test him to make sure that, okay, if you say this God that you serve is real, then prove it. So I would take money from him. I would literally physically fight him. I would do horrible things just to test him, and not once ever raising his hand or yelling at me since that incident. And so what that taught me is that it taught me to see this strong man wrestle with this curse, and also too with the PTSD and how to express himself. And what I saw was vulnerability. And what it did is gave me permission to be vulnerable. So again, I started, making the compare and contrast within in 2016 of some of the things that were going on. Is if I'm going to take it upon myself to work on myself and to forgive myself, but then also use myself as an example for others instead of pointing the finger and being, the product of my own environment. I want to be an example to get to almost kind of get people to understand how to reset themselves, because there are a lot of things that we endure growing up that we don't understand, and that hopefully we can kind of bridge gaps and come together. And so what I did is started researching, art history wise, who is an artist that, best documented traumatic, situations, experiences. And so, Francisco Goya, he, documenting the Spanish War and the disaster war series, and just how he was able to kind of repeat the image, the foreground, the middle ground, the background. And so there was repetition there. And then also too, me thinking like, okay, well, if this whole police brutality is continuing to happen year after year after, how can I insert myself into the canon to shed the story in a contemporary manner and to reframe it for a positive change? And so therefore I started looking at Christianity as a vehicle to do that, because again, I didn't really understood this God that my father was serving, Christianity as a religion of, what's the point of going to church every Sunday and, believing in these principles, but then yet when Sunday is over, you go back to, some of the things that are hidden. And so I started looking at more into other artists and art history, and looked at the psychology of color and how that plays a role. So Joseph Alberts, and looking at how he had his students test colors and looking at those colors that vibrate and that are categorized as traumatic. So what I did is started thinking about my grandmother, because she was a safe haven for me. She would go to Piggly Wiggly on Fridays and get me art supplies. And what I did is I would sit beside her and use those art supplies. And what those art supplies did is it allowed me to open up myself, as well as to reconnect the vulnerability that I, was able to continue to see once my father accepted Christ. And one of the things that that I would get is from her was the scratch pads, to wherein it would be the crayon color underneath, the black on top, and from that I would scratch in and draw whatever I was seeing, whatever I wanted to draw. Sometimes it would be her, sometimes it would be the characters on the actors on the soap opera, sometimes it would be whatever was in around me. So thinking of that vulnerability, and openness with interacting with my grandmother, as well as my father and how he displayed the vulnerability once he accepted Christ, I needed to find a place of vulnerability. I needed to find a place to wherein I can let myself be, to express my feelings, and to find a place of reprieve. And so remaking these scratch pads was my way of doing that. And so I looked at photographs of my father when he was little, and in high school, when he was in the military. And those photos I started from there because it was before he had his family, before he bared children, he had children. And I painted his portraits on top of those scratch pads. So I used the crayons that were, dealing with vibrating colors of trauma underneath, paint the black on top, and then I would paint my father's portrait on top of that as best as I could. And then afterwards, I started thinking about that place of reprieve because as a child, I wasn't able to fight back to protect myself. I wasn't able to stand up for myself, and even to love myself. I didn't know what that meant. And so this was a place in doing that. And then I also looked at the fact of this God that my father was serving in religion, as far as Christianity. What are some of these principles that he's abiding by? So one of the things that I saw within the Bible and read that that Peter asked Jesus, "How many times do you forgive your brother?" And it states in the Bible 7 times 70. What's the answer? That was the answer. And so I just took the multiple application of 7 and made 49 portraits of my father. And then because my father used his tools to abuse me in other things, I took it upon myself to use tools to discard the portraits. And for me, what I learned from that is it gave me that reprieve, it gave me that space and that place. But it also opened up another door of forgiveness, not from an emotional standpoint, but more from like that physical act. And, I learned that for me, it's about excavating. I'm literally excavating my own past, learning about my own history, and then to be able to authentically go out into the world and talk about some of these internal struggles that I have dealt with and still continue to deal with. So to bring it forward, hoping that, we as, African Americans can all look at our own internal struggles for connectivity. And I think once we kind of look, we know the general aspects of our past, but to really go deep within ourselves and to really figure out and excavate and learn how we can reset ourselves in a place for transcending. I think that's where the unity comes in, and the value of self, learning to love oneself. And so within that, taking that into the context of currently what's going on, I think yes, it's sad that it's what's happening. It's frustrating. You know, I get pissed off seeing, going on social media, seeing what's continuing to happen. But there is a part and a point of juncture that I will continue personally to rally for and speak about and hopefully share and connect with others, that if we don't forgive ourselves, how can we forgive others? And I think love for me and forgiving myself from what I have learned and understood and actually taken upon myself to self-therapy is something that is needed as a
Charles,
starting point. It's a starting point.
thank you, Charles. I'm going to have to interject, and I feel terrible about doing that, but I just wanted to make clear to all in attendance that Charles was the one who first introduced me to the term that is the topic today, of radical forgiveness, and his story when he first shared that with me. He happened to share it while I was videotaping an interview for the Petrucci Family Foundation. And it burned itself into my consciousness and my psyche. And I just wanted to, before we move on, I just wanted to say to everybody that that was such an amazing vector for me. And I really appreciate, Charles, we'll get back to this later, but I really appreciate the notion of vulnerability. Delita and I were laughing about this in our last conversation. Willie and I talk about this all the time. People think we walk into the studio and bring an idea and execute the idea and leave. They don't understand the extent to which the kind of faith you're talking about in oneself, the kind of love of oneself, the kind of willingness to radically forgive oneself is actually the catalyst for great art making. So if you'll forgive me, I'll move on. Thank you, Charles. We'll get back to you. Second, today, we want to keep moving forward, folks, is Delita Martin. These are my words, as Willie says, these are how I frame my understanding of them. So I own these, but as far as I'm concerned, Delita Martin is an exemplary artist as well. She creates these distinctive figurative works that they often enshrine women of color within ancestral and contemporary settings of mystical power. Her cast of characters are often stoic, self-contained, and always possessing of their own what I call their own spiritual authority. So I won't go on any further. Delita, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us today. Where can you take us with what you're doing with your own work and the concept of radical forgiveness?
Thank you. Thank everyone for joining. Thank you for having me. When you first came to me about this topic, the subject, I had never really thought about forgiveness. Forgiveness for me was something that you just did. And so I started to think about how am I processing forgiveness in my life and in my work, but also, I think more importantly, where did the idea of forgiveness come from? Where did I learn about forgiveness? And so I started thinking about it, and I started looking through my work. And the first image I'd like to share with you is Remembrance. And that particular image is really a handwritten story about my mother. And I realized that forgiveness has been something that has been handed down from generation to generation. I think that particularly in people of color, the idea of forgiveness is handed down as a tool to, I guess, counter physical, mental, as well as emotional trauma, and to kind of prevent you from getting into those situations in a way. In this particular piece, my mother was a domestic worker, and oftentimes I'd go to work with her because, she didn't have anyone to keep me, so I would go with her. And she was taking care of an elderly lady, Miss Molly, and Miss Molly was dealing with dementia. And she would often refer to my mother as Callie, her slave. And she would call me Gal. And she would tell me, hey, Gal, go out to that field and tell Jim to come in the house. I need him to do something. Or she would, refer to my mother as a good nigger. You're a good nigger. You're good. And my mother would smile, and she would say, Miss Kelly, please, she would say, Miss Molly, you shouldn't talk like that. You shouldn't say things like that. And for me as a child, seeing this, it was fascinating to see Miss Molly be in the present day, and then revert back to a time that I was, that I had no concept of, and in a sense transport me and my mother back to that time. But what I noticed was it never stopped my mother from being a wonderful caretaker. It never stopped her from doing her job. But at the same time, I could see on her face a weariness, being tired of having to confront this. And Miss Molly's children were there. They sometimes, and they wouldn't say anything. They never once took my mother aside to apologize or to say, I understand this is difficult for you. None of that was ever said. But what I took from that was she was doing what was necessary to for our family to survive. And so on this particular piece, I hand wrote that story, a particular story, an encounter that I had with Miss Molly and my mother, and what it was like being there at that moment and being taken back to that time and cast as a slave, essentially. And so after looking at that piece, I started to think about, well, how do I process this in my work? How does forgiveness, how do I forgive? And what I learned is that forgiveness, until you are able to find self-awareness, which I talk about a lot in my work, like in the piece New Beginnings, until you are self-aware and you have self-forgiveness, it's not something that you can, extend to someone else. It's not something that you're able to offer to someone else. And so I think that's where radical forgiveness begins. At least for me, it does. And so I talk about enlightenment in my work. I talk about being able to center myself, being able to be a whole person. And I don't think that I would be able to forgive or teach my son to forgive unless I had that. And so a lot of my works, I use different symbols. Like in New Beginnings, I use the symbol of the persimmon. The idea that the persimmon symbolizes transition, and the idea that you're transitioning into a better person, a different person, a person of forgiveness. And so you can also see that in works like Six Persimmons. In that particular piece, it's actually a self-portrait. And in that piece, I'm having a conversation with myself, with my inner self. The whole idea of balance and being in balance with who I am, and being able to process in that way. So one of the things that's been important for me is how do I teach my son to forgive? How do I teach my son not to be an angry Black man? And I thought about the lessons of my mother and the circumstances, the time period that we were in at that time, and how times are so different now, particularly what we're going through now. How do I teach my son not to be angry? How do I teach him not to be afraid? And how do I teach him to be a positive role model, to be, a contributor to society in a good way? And so the other day, like everyone else, we were watching the news and looking at the protests and the events, and it was so overwhelming. And if I was feeling it, I knew that he was feeling it as well. And so I wanted to talk to him about what was happening. I wanted to understand what he was feeling as a young person. And I also wanted him to understand how I felt as his mother, the fears that I had as his mother. And so we sat down and we had a dialogue, and I asked him if I could draw him. And I asked him if I could create a work. And so as we talked, he cut circles for me out of paper. He posed for me. We talked about the composition of the work, but we talked about what was happening, which was the most important part of what was happening. And I realized at that time that I was teaching him about forgiveness. And it was an embodiment in this artwork that we were creating together. And whereas I think the difference between in the way that my mother taught me, which was through watching her actions, I was teaching my son in a much different way of being present in the moment, confronting the moment, and not being as quiet about it, but doing it in a positive way. And so that we created the piece, Let Me Breathe. And I asked him, I said, a lot of people, are saying, I can't breathe. A lot of people are saying, hands up, don't shoot. I said, what do you want your shirt to say? Because he always wears hoodies. And I asked him, I said, well, what do you want your hoodie to say? He had a design on his hoodie, and he said, let me breathe. And that was so poignant to me, because he was not asking permission. He was taking a stand for something that was rightfully his. And so we were able to, I felt like, teaching him to confront how he feels, to express how he feels, and to do it in such a way to be seen. And so I started working on these works, and he's been in the studio with me, he's been assisting me, and he's been helping me. And so we did another piece with his cousin, Say Our Names. And so just the idea of me being able to pass this on to my son, even though it looks differently in the way that my mother passed this lesson on to me, it's important that I teach him to forgive in the way, but stand up for himself at the same time. So seeing it transition in my work and being able to have him with me in the studio and work through that has been really profound for me in how I think about forgiveness, and how I work through that myself.
And forgiveness is power, not surrender.
Exactly. Forgiveness is absolutely power, and letting him know that he doesn't have to be angry or violent to have power, that he has power in his creative self. He has power, in his words and how he stands and how he presents himself to the world.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Delita. I mean, we'll get to touch on a few more things when we have our Q&A, but I just really appreciate that. I remember when I went online and saw Let Me Breathe for the first time, and I think it was right after, was it just between Aubrey and George Floyd, somewhere around there? It seemed to be as we were sort of getting over one grief and the other grief was happening, and it just came out. And I remember looking at it, and it froze me in the moment, which is what I think all great art should do. It should arrest us. And I was arrested in a positive way in that moment. And I'm very grateful that you have found this way to convert these times, which are still a verb. They're still evolving. We don't know where we'll be tomorrow. And I think that's something that I'll jump to Willie in a minute because he's the master of this. But, this idea of a set place where we speak from, or a set voice. And I know that for a lot of artists like yourself who had a routine, the wheels keep grinding, but you've sort of sidetracked it to incorporate other things. But for some of us, we're not even sure how to begin to process. We're not even sure what we want to glean from the situation as yet. And that's frustrating as well as the trauma that we're suffering. So there's, I think it's a great time for us to speak as creatives. And I'm going to be quiet and introduce our last panelist today, which is Willie Cole, who I known for a while on and off. He's a nationally, internationally acclaimed visual artist and conceptual artist. And he's also one of the most creatively powerful artists and equally enlightened spirits that I had the pleasure of knowing in my life. Willie has an acute eye, an ability to stay within culture, celebrate spirituality, and then, in my mind, just sort of step back and make assessments and extract from experiences and create forms that become, in my mind, shrines for those particular kinds of interactions. So that's an unrehearsed summary of Willie. He'll probably call me later and deny it, but we're good enough friends. Everyone, I'd like to, we're very pleased to introduce our third distinguished artist, Mr. Willie Cole. Willie, what do you got for us?
Well, thank you very much. You two guys, Delita and Charles, your stories are so moving and so personal. And I have some trauma in my life too that I'm not willing to talk about. So I really admire you for that. But I do have one that I'm going to try to touch on a little bit without embarrassing my family members. So I will share my screen with you. About 12 years ago, I had a separation from my family, from my wife and my daughters. And that was traumatic for me. I think that my state of depression probably lasted 5 years. And I had a show scheduled the first year that they left. And I couldn't focus on anything. I actually did portraits of myself every day. I did drawings of people crying. So when the show came, the pieces I'm showing you now are part of that exhibition. And there was a review in Art Forum that didn't really comment on the art, but they commented on my sadness. So in this presentation, I have 3 projects that I want to show you that had kind of emotional impact for me that are, I guess, about forgiveness, or at least my reaction to the trauma that required forgiveness. So this first piece here is called Medicine Man. Medicine Man, of course, to me, this is Cupid with a shotgun. Not just an angel, but in particular, the love angel. I wanted to get that Yves Klein blue, but I was thinking about the pink and blue that represents the males and females. And my thought, this character actually began from a poem and then a screenplay and then a sculpture. Thinking about how if Cupid was in the modern world today, bow and arrows would not work because our hearts are cold and hard. So he would need a shotgun. So that's how it came about. And hopefully one day in the near future, you'll hear more about him in a graphic novel or something. But he was a centerpiece of that exhibition. I've done several angels like this, different sizes, all in pink and blue. This was a 3-channel video presentation. The journey up to this piece is called Samsara, which refers to the endless cycle of rebirth that humans experience. And I guess I was going through that kind of rebirth. But I actually got about 20 actors and auditioned them to see who could cry on command. So they're projected in the gallery in New York, and it was a very, very sad room. I mean, people came in there and left crying. So I have an example of one of the videos here. But after her audition, I asked her what was on her mind, how she cried like that. Because she really came into the gallery and sat down and started crying. And the way that she did that, she said that she had purchased a cat from a shelter a few days earlier. And when she got home, the cat was very sick, and she discovered the cat had cancer. So she used that thought to generate her emotions. This piece was about my feelings. So you see that, I imagine that heart was like a puddle of my grief being licked up by three crazy dogs. So I have to say, I don't have any hard feelings towards my ex. So I guess that means I have forgiven her. I never really charged her with anything. I think I was mostly charging myself. I was feeling like I had failed. It was the biggest commitment of my life, and it didn't work. And it took me a while to handle it, partly because I come from a family of divorced people, and I wanted to be different. So that's as personal as I get. Now, I noticed, touched on religion as well. So I have these pieces here to kind of touch on maybe temptation and forgiveness and gullibility, I guess. So Isaac and Abraham, except Abraham has a gun instead of a knife and a target on his son's chest. And I took the line from one of Cher's movies where she slapped somebody and says, "Snap out of it." So I have the angel giving us that line. This one is some forgiveness in here as well, but this was a response to 9/11. You know, I grew up in the Christian church as well. I probably went every Sunday. My great-grandfather was a minister on both sides of my family, mother and father. So when they started showing photos of bin Laden and his crew sitting in caves, it reminded me of illustrations from the Bible. So I began to think about that, I guess you call it that fatal day for JC and what that would have been like. This piece is called No Time for Supper. And they all have AK-47s. There's a companion piece of this that I don't have in his presentation that shows his mother, the Holy Mother, the Virgin Mary. And she's now taken on the guise of a suicide bomber wearing a explosive vest, but I don't have that in this folder. So what is the forgiveness here? There is no forgiveness. There's just reaction. And I guess reaction is the opposite side of forgiveness. These pieces here might even be more specific. I was invited to come to the Cameron Museum in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is where my dad is from, actually, because the school, it was commemorating the anniversary of the School Desegregation Act. And in the town of Navassa, which is a small town on Cape Fear, where my family's from, they closed down all the Black schools during that time and forced those kids to go to other schools, but most of them didn't have transportation to get there. As a result, many of them didn't get past the 3rd or 4th grade. But those adults, those children who are adults now, collaborated with the museum to present an exhibition about their experiences, and they asked me to be part of it. So I made classrooms, and I used key words like civil and rights and black and white to speak about those times. I started doing blackboards a long time, but most of these pieces are from years ago, because now I seem to be Wee Willie Water Bottle, Willie the Scorch, and Willie Schumacher. So my latest bodies of work are in those 3 materials: water bottles, shoes, and even in the 90s and 80s, a steam iron. But I also came into this business as a writer, wanting to be a visual artist. So making these pieces were fun for me. And I'll show you some details in the classroom. So this is the blackboard for the word civil. And you can read, I'll read some of the sentences out loud. So these are what I call backronyms. So I take the keyword, which is civil, and I find a word to fit with each letter. So I'll read the second one. It says, color isn't very important lately. Now, some of them have corrections, scratch out, write-ins in red, because these are issues that we should learn about in school or did learn about in school. So I tried to make them look like they were corrected by the teacher. And some of these sentences are very appropriate for today, whether forgiving or blaming. Coexistence isn't voted into law. Colored institutions vacates its land. Communication is vital in learning. Change in voting impact lives. Confederate ideology voids integration laws. Close-up, intensely visceral images linger. That is definitely today. I have had big issues by seeing this photo nonstop of the foot or the knee on Mr. Floyd's neck. And of course, take it all the way back to the Europeans coming to the US or the Portuguese going to the continent of Africa. The last sentence, chief in the village isn't laughing. So that means that the chief is not dealing in forgiveness. This one is rights. So our rights are on the line. The first sentence says, run inside, get help, tell somebody, which is a good thing. Rioting isn't gonna hurt the situation. Resisting integration got him to Senate. Raleigh and Jen helped tame students. Ruthless individuals gut half the school. Racist institutions guaranteed him their support. This is all pre-Trump stuff too. Rioter immediately gave her the seat. Racist insists God had to segregate. Reverend instructs groups how to survive. So that was in the classroom for rights. Okay, so in that same classroom, I had the words black and the word white. So under black, I have best learners always cherish knowledge. That's BLACK. Bodies left afloat confirm killing. That one's very personal for me. I had a cousin who was found floating in Cape Fear. Become like a colored king. The attitude that we should all embrace, whatever color we are. Boys lynched as courthouse kindles. Beautiful ladies always carry knives. This one, next one is personal for me too. Blues legend annoys Christian kin. So that's you go to the family cookout and you got a crazy uncle with a process and a guitar in his back. And everybody else is buttoned down for church. And he's got the gold teeth and he's embarrassing everybody. And he should be forgiven. Bring light and constant knowledge. Before leaving, always clean kitchen. Say that to your help. Blessings, love, abundance, compassion, and kindness is our cure. And the last blackboard here is the word white. Funny thing about this exhibition, of course, the people from Navassa were all black people, but the whole museum staff was white. And there was some discomfort in the room. Under WHITE, women have it too easy. Now, these, of course, are not opinions. These are just, this is a word game for me, but I sit in front of the TV news sometimes and riff on what they're saying and shorten it into these sentences. Wild, hairy intruders topple empire. So that's playing on the cliches about the Spaniards and the Europeans coming to Africa or to South America. War heroes' injuries tell everything. When hatred increases, truth exits. Widowed husband inherits the empire. We hire immigrant talent exclusively. White hoods intended 10 executions. Who here is the exception? White history isn't telling everything. So those are my experiences to share with you guys. Like I said, some of it is a little personal, but not as personal as the previous two artists. So I really admire you guys for that, for sure. I will say, just to get a little more personal, that in my work with the Scorches, it wasn't so much about forgiveness as I was producing it. I didn't recognize how much it applied to my own personal history. I knew my great-grandmother was a domestic, but I did not recognize the violence in the act of scorching. Until one graduate student was writing a paper about me. She called me on the phone and she asked me if the pieces had anything to do with domestic violence. I never thought about that, but the first 12 years of my life were pretty violent. So hopefully my heart and my courage will get as big as Charles and Delita, and one day I'll be able to speak more about that. Thank you.
We're delighted that you were able to give us as much as you have. If everyone would turn their microphones on, please. Willie and Charles and Delita, we're going to open this up for questions and answer, but also just discourse. I think I'll lead it off with two things. One, hearing Delita to speak about her having to go with her mother as a domestic and deal with people with Alzheimer's. That was also part of my story when I first came to America from Jamaica. So when my friends would go, play at school nights, I was cleaning lawyers' offices. And, I remember the first time a 7-year-old white child called my mother nigger to her face. And she literally put her hand in front of me because we needed the $30, Right. And how trying to become an artist later in life didn't seem like it was the appropriate payback for that kind of sacrifice. But watching what Willie just put up, watching what all of you have said, I think it is a sublime payback. It is us carrying their history forward, some of it with rage, deservedly, but most of it as a way to preserve and speak about the world and the lens through which we see things and understand things. And with that in mind, the second thing for me, and I just throw this out there, and please, anyone who's still in the room, you have a chat button there. Just type the messages in. Claudia will pick them up, and we'll posit those questions to our guests. But it has been an unrelenting emotional state of being this last 2 weeks. And I hate saying that because the suffix of the last 2 weeks is untrue. It's constant. But it seems to be, it is particularly intense right now, as if the tectonic forces that have kept racism in place and kept subjugation and injustice crushing at us to form something stronger, which is a beautiful image, but it's also, we're being crushed before we become the diamonds we are. And this week seems to have been, well, it is more relentless. And yesterday, or the day before, reading about Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, and realizing, when you listen to Nina Simone and she talks about Mississippi, goddamn, it sounds dated, right? But right now we got two senators from Kentucky that I don't see the difference between what they are doing now and what people from Mississippi and Alabama were doing freely and happily before. And the idea that this gentleman is holding up a bill, the idea that lynching is still not a federal hate crime, and the idea that this gentleman is holding it up because of the semantics between bruising and murder, I am struggling to find a way to forgive. I have to process first. We as a people have always, it's been incumbent on us to forgive. It's the way we survive. Someone asked recently, why did all the Black preachers in South Carolina vote for Joe Biden when they knew that Bernie Sanders was the one who was really putting an agenda that could help us and was most directly related to us? And my answer, unrehearsed, was that we're practical people. Survival is the first thing. And we'll go with whoever we think will help us survive and not who will be a radical representation to those who oppress us. And looking at each one of you and the art that you're making and thinking about where we are now, is there any way in which, beyond what you've shown us, it has affected your practice, it has affected your thinking? Where are you with this in the moment? Where are you now in this moment? Anyone of you can. Willie?
You're saying, where are we now in this moment as a result of the times we're in?
Yeah, because right now I don't, the radical forgiveness, part of it is going out and standing up and demanding to be heard. I think it was, it was you that says, was it Delita, reaction is the opposite side of forgiveness? But it seems to me that right now reaction is necessary, a necessary part of forgiveness, or am I wrong?
Well, forgiveness, I would say, is a reaction itself. So I would say a reaction is a necessary part of forgiveness. But forgiveness is only one choice, only one reaction. I think for me, I'm not experiencing forgiveness because I'm not blaming anybody for anything. You know what I mean? So
Listening.
I think that we are, we're basically like 2 or 3 herds of sheep, and we have crazy shepherds who lead us down crazy roads, and most of us follow. We also create positive, negative energy with our words and our images that get into our consciousness without our awareness sometimes, just through TV and music. And so I find it hard to place the blame sometimes. So I'd rather just go with awareness and the lessons that leads me to. A person, to me, that's guilty is always guilty. Even if I said I forgive you, you're still guilty. And depending on the size of your offense, it is not easy to forget.
I think for me, it's the immediacy of the response and the directness of the response. I am a printmaker and a letterpress printer, and a mixed media printmaker, and bringing the two worlds together, text and imagery, in the way that I have in the last week or so, has been very different for me in terms of practice, in terms of speaking, thinking about the work and thinking about my life in connection to the work, because they are parallel, they go together. Thinking about my son in what he's facing as a 16-year-old, as someone who's going into his senior year, about to graduate. And I realized that he does not see race in the way that I saw race growing up, in the way that my mother taught me about race. Growing up as a 70s child, and for my parents, it was shortly after the civil rights. They taught us to be able to walk into a room, assess, and recognize if you were in danger or if you were not. And in having that conversation with my child the other day, I realized very quickly he has no sense of that.
It's the same with my sons.
He has no sense of that. So we were talking about, we were speaking about Ahmaud Arbery, and my son is a runner and he runs every day. And we live in a predominantly white area. I think we're one of 2 Black families. And I'm so afraid that he's not going to come back one day. But I don't want him to live life in fear. I want him to be fearless in the way that he lives. And when I explained this to him, his response to me was, well, everyone around here knows that I'm a runner, that I run. And it was jarring, his response, because I said, well, sweetheart, they understood that he ran. That was his neighborhood. That was their neighborhood. And he looked at me with all innocence and said, oh, So I realized that he processes this differently. And on one hand, that's amazing, because we're creating a generation of young children, young kids, young men and women that are not necessarily putting a negative emphasis on race, but it's also very dangerous, because he could clearly not understand being in a situation that he needs to get out of. And that frightens me. So it's like, how do I teach him, how do I process that? And my way of doing that was bringing him into the studio, talking to him and having him work with me and express himself.
Right. Charles, and then we'll open it up. Any thoughts on that, my brother?
I've just been sitting and listening. I think, you know, one of the things that Willie said is the awareness. I mean, and I do run as well. I run every day, but, you know, since the killing of Anthony, it's when I'm running to the park, when I'm looking at white people, I'm looking at them differently. You know, I try to continue to have this self-preservation of forgiveness, but I think now it's more about awareness. And then I also, you know, try to look at what are some other, you know, we're all in a system. So I try to think about, like, what are some other ways that I can kind of interject a system. And, you know, so one of the things I've thought about within this, you know, pandemic is, you know, the healthcare industry is continuing to still run and still to go. And we collectively, we need a place of reprieve. We do. And so I've thought about, you know, ways of the healthcare industry, art therapy, and how to, you know, influence that even more within this whole radical forgiveness and awareness of has been happening. So, yeah.
Gloria, do we have any questions that have come in or ones?
Yes, there is a question that came in from Cameron Downey. Question is, riffing off of Charles's use of the term excavating in the face of his trauma, those experiences, I live and love in Minneapolis and felt actively the relief that came with the burning down of the 3rd Precinct, a capital of violence from the city. Where might destruction or the taking apart find its home in forgiveness?
I think it's about, you know, I can understand the looting, the violence, I'm sorry, not the violence, but the burnings, and I think it's about reconstructing. I think it's about, you know, starting over and seeing this rebirth of unity, change, and justice. You know, but then also I see the other sides of it is, you know, that we need these, you know, businesses, we need these places to continue to survive. It's just like what Beresford talked about with, you know, the South Carolina preachers, you know, and supporting, you know. So yeah, I mean, I understand it, but then I also think, you know, there has to be some other way, and I don't have the answers, but I think there just has to be some sort of other way that we can reconstruct. So yeah, that's my opinion on that.
Willie, Delita, anything on that last question?
I think of it in very much the same way as, you know, the tearing down of a system of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where do we take it from there? What do we do? You know, I mean, that's essentially the question of how do we do this? But I've also been thinking about lately, you know, I've had friends to come to me that were not Black that said, how can I help? What do I do? And my response has been, you know, I don't need you to go out and get more Black friends. But what I need you to do is to be aware of injustices and situations around you and not be silent. Be a part of that change. And after I said it, I started thinking to myself, I said, well, I can easily say that, but they're probably living in a system that they're accustomed to, that they may not understand that it's wrong because it's something that they've done over and over, that they've seen over and over and over. So the question again becomes, how do we break that cycle? What do we do? So again, I don't have the answers, but I understand the idea of the tearing down of a system, and for the burning, the destruction, that's symbolic of that to me.
Let me ask you, if you don't mind, how do you feel when people white people that come to you, approach you and say, hey, how are you? How are you doing? I mean, what kind of, I mean, I have my feelings about it, but just want to kind of hear from you and Willie, you
You
know.
mean during this time in
Yeah,
response?
yeah, yeah.
Well,
Because I've had it happen to me several times, so I just want to kind of.
so you guys are more in the world than I am. I took the quarantine very serious. I go to the house once a month. No one is approaching me.
With a blue shotgun, Willie?
My response
Shotgun, yeah.
is exactly what I said.
Right.
I don't need you. I don't need to be the black friend. I don't need you to have guilt. I don't want you to have guilt. What I want you to do is I want you to be present. I want you to be present in what's happening in a system that oppresses others, that endangers the lives of others, you know, people that are around you that aren't just like you, or just a different skin color. And that has been my response to them. But
I do have kind of a related story. I live in a community where I was probably the official integrator of this community. I chose to move here because I need to get out of the big city for a while. You know, I had 2 young daughters, and I discovered this little town, and the police chief was black. So I said, okay, I'll be safe here. And now the town doesn't have a police department anymore. So as my kids got into the school system, I became the Black History Month committee.
Right.
You know, and I would go there and do all the cases in the hallways and stuff. And I would give them things to read over the PA system every morning. But one day, my daughter came home and she told me that one of the little white kids came to her and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry your grandmother was a slave." So you're talking about pity and guilt. So in our process of education and awareness, guilt was created. And I don't know if I don't think that was the intention of it, but it was a tricky slope, you know. So today, as I watch the news and they show these videos over and over again, and people are sending violent videos all over the Instagram and Facebook, I feel there's got to be another approach. I mean, we are aware that the world is going insane, but the reason I said that we're all sheep because maybe it's just me. I'm a news junkie, so you know I have CNN on with the sound turned down while I'm in the studio playing music and working. But I don't need anybody to send me pictures of women getting beat by police, you know, through the internet. And I'm not sure where I'm headed here, but it seems like the right approach has not been exercised yet.
If I may skip the stone across the water. And again, this is unformulated, but that's the nature of these salons. As someone who came from, you know, as Damian Marley and Nas says, you know, we're distant cousins. You know, we're all brought here. We're literally the survivors of our people, literally, metaphorically, creatively, etc. But one of the things that was very difficult for me as someone who was born and raised on an island, you know, a little mountain in the middle of the ocean in Jamaica, to come here was a lot of friends from Africa say the same thing. You didn't know that we were Black until we came here. And it sounds really awful. But, you know, no one could have called me nigger or said I was Black in school because it was the UN. You know, we had children from around the world. We had white kids, whatever. So it never occurred to me that there was such a binary system. And to me, one of the things I think that has to be addressed beyond, as Willie said, the obvious, beyond the constant steady diet of violence and steady diet of and steady cycles of violence, outrage, minor change, acceptance, quote unquote normality, violent. You know, it just keeps the grist mill keeps turning. And one of the things that has occurred to me is that maybe we're at a point where there can be an internal reckoning that's on a humanist level, that everyone understands that we were brought from a continent 2.5 times the size of Europe, from different countries, and resigned to a color. And the term Black is actually the absence of color, as we all know, you know, which is, it can be beautiful because it means that we're absorbing all the color. We're not reflecting them, we're bringing them all in. But the inverse is true, and I believe harmful in a similar way that is not being addressed. And I think that's maybe some of what I see as white internal tension, and that is when quote unquote white people are removed from their own ethnicity, they are also tarred as a function of a binary system with becoming a color. And so they understand, and this is just my opinion, that there's a benefit to that in this system. They're going to move towards what is beneficial. That's a humanist thing. But at the same time, they belong to Italian or Portuguese or Romanian or whatever. And America calls itself a melting pot, but it's actually quite the opposite. It is saying to everybody, none of that has relevance. You now belong to a binary system and you benefit from a binary system. And your role in the binary system to keep that system intact is to react to these people who are Black and on this part of the binary system. And I think there's internal tensions that quote unquote white people can deal with on their own, as Delita says and as Willie says. It's not so much that they come to us for the answers. Yes, there are things that you can do. Yes, we appreciate your marching. Yes, we appreciate not the microaggressions, but the micro victories, the micro awareness aspect of it. But maybe it's time, maybe at this point of disruption, of tectonic disruption, culturally, maybe it's time, as someone said recently, and I posted on Facebook, you know, it's really not up to us to change a system we didn't design. And maybe part of the deal when people who consider themselves white in the system come and ask or feel sorry for us is to remind them that they have reconciling to do on a humanist level as well. And that has huge implications for understanding.
Even changing the system is not going to change society, though, because individuals, you know, this is such a part of our DNA almost, this whole racist thing in this country. Most white folks don't know they're racist. You know?
No,
You know, it's just they got that so-called backpack of privilege, and they've had it for generations. It never crossed their mind they're racist. So the fact that they've done something racist or said something wrong, you know, just goes over their head.
Most recently was, forgive me for interrupting, was Drew Brees, you know, as a sports player and someone I've watched. I mean, no inclination whatsoever of anything the man has ever said or done that said he was racist, but he could only see the Kaepernick protests in the context of his own personal history and not in the larger context of the ideals of the country that he salutes the flag for. So I appreciate what you said.
Yeah, that's how it works. That's how it works. So are we going to talk towards solution? Are we going to analyze problem? Or are we going to just report the bad news?
Well, what else do we have for questions, Claudia? We're going to fit one or two more in.
I think, yeah, let's put in one more question because this might kind of encapsulate all of that. So from Jim Toya, I think you have to forgive that question of how are you? We all experience that at some point. My situation as a sympathetic white person, forgive that description, is how do I introduce a more sympathetic view of your experience to a white privileged culture that is so disconnected from the real truths that Black and Brown Americans experience on a daily basis?
Education, but real education. I think we live in a world of sound bites. Get a snip. You have the TikTok, you have Instagram, you have the college of Facebook. I mean, all of that, you have to bypass that and get to real conversations. You know, when you talk about, you know, race, when you talk about feminism, when you talk about all of those subjects, have a conversation, a dialogue, and not a soundbite. You know, and that calls for research. That calls for really digging into the history of how something is rooted in place. And it just, you know, I hear people that, you know, will come to me and say, hey, did you hear about XYZ? And I'm like, yeah, but that didn't really happen. Read this, read the actual article and go do some research behind that. So we have to get away from this soundbite culture.
Really, Charles?
And change is going to be slow for sure. Well, we've already experienced legislation for civil rights and equality. So, you know, I think education is the only true road. and it's going to take a while. I'm talking
Yeah.
3 or 4 more generations to really get to equality.
Yeah, I agree.
And about your kids, yeah, I have an experience with my kids as well. You know, my mother grew up in the suburbs in a small white town, the only black person in the school. I went to an all-white high school that turned black. By the time I was a senior, it was mostly black. And my kids went to all white schools. And they have no sense of race. And I would tell myself, well, hey, they're living Martin Luther King's dream.
Yeah.
We all believed in that dream, and now our kids are living it, so we can't complain about it. You know?
Yeah.
Charles?
Yeah, no, research education. I mean, both. And that's what I believe in, you know, instead of the sound bites. So, yeah, well said from both of you guys.
But sound bites is an educational tool. It's the educational tool that populates sound bites. People remember those sound bites. You know, my whole blackboards are pretty much sound bites.
Like a hip hop hook, right?
Yeah.
You remember the song because of the hook.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know. Of course, voting is part of the solution too. Get the right people in office. But on an individual level, it's going to take a lot of education is necessary.
And understand.
Sorry, Delita, please there. Go ahead.
I was just about to say, understanding that voting at a local level.
Oh, it's the most important.
Right. Right.
A lot of times people get, you know, they think, well, if I vote for president, I'm like, no, if you vote for, you know, the local sheriff or the, you know,
School board.
If that's going to be.
Folks that don't campaign much, we don't know much about them. When I get into the voting booth, I often don't know any of the people except for the presidents or the governors. You know?
Well,
so how do you remedy that? That's education too, or is that just disseminating information at the right time in the right place?
One thing that we haven't had time to deal with, and we won't today, but I just want to put this raw fish on the table, and that is something that's different this time around than it has been previously for people Willie's age and my age, you know, because, and that is instant information. Not just instant information as, you know, sound bites, but I don't know about all of you, but one of the most heartwarming things was to see images of George Floyd in a Syrian refugee camp in Paris, to see Piccadilly Circus during a much tighter lockdown in the UK with thousands and thousands of people, to see the world, because of the blessing of this pandemic, suffering aside, arrested for one moment, which I never thought I would see in my life. And I don't think anyone in this group or in this, you know, that are part of the audience, you know, fight me about it. But if the world was normal, this wouldn't be happening, you know, and that's something that we as artists and creatives are now, that's part of the contours of our own lives as creatives, and that whatever we do and put out there, you know, there used to be guardians. There used to be people who determined whether we would get a show at a certain gallery, whether or not the kind of work about abuse that Charles was putting out there was tasteful enough or too colorful. There are all these codified words that said, we don't want to deal with your blackness and your Americanness as blackness.
Right.
And now we make the work and we put it out there. And I'm not talking about Instagram famous where I'm getting 100 photographs of you every 10 days. I'm talking about the fact that when Delita puts that out there, there's a cadre of people surrounding her work, and it has immediate influence and impact. And in the strangest way, and I've just thought of this now, it took these continued profane acts of brutality to kind of wake the world up to what the artists were already doing, which is give us the immediacy of response, the immediacy of absorbing and not just being conquered by, but absorbing, and as Delita did, reiterating, sitting with her son, engaging, creating a new thing, creating that dongled knock-on effect of consciousness, which I think is some way that artists who are with us in this or are with us in future salons, I think that's one way we can move forward, whether or not we're doing the best work of our career or just work that helps us deal with the situation. But I think we have to embrace the idea that while we're alone in our predicament in this country, we are not alone in the predicament of people of color around the world, and that people of color around the world are using the language of our suffering, the language of our revolution, the language of the 60s, the language of resistance that is written, thinking of Delita's first piece about her mother, that is obscenely written across all these acts that have been on our backs and continue to be on our backs. And in that way, moving forward with, evolution says, it never says either or, it says and with. And channeling Willie here, but moving forward with these things rather than them becoming impediments is a powerful tool.
Yeah, I agree.
Charles?
No, I agree. Totally agree.
I just had a couple passing thoughts. And one was a remembrance of my last visit to South Africa, where they had the reconciliation committee. I guess everybody was forgiven, but nothing was that different. Like I go into the Museum of Natural History. I'm looking at all these life-size dioramas of Bushmen. I come out of the museum, and everybody who's homeless in the park around the museum is a Bushman. Now I'm there to speak at a school, the Makala School of Art. So my hosts are all white South Africans. So I get to have that social scene with them, and they all have their houses surrounded by alarms and barbed wire. They're so afraid of the blacks. So forgiving does not solve the problem.
And that's the term radical. It takes something that is antithetical to the act of forgiving. And that's why Charles started this discourse, because everything he told us about his deeply personal past, for the average person, forgiveness is not the first term that comes to mind. It takes a radicalization in the opposite direction to destruction to begin to reconcile. Not so much as you said, Willie, the immediate sort of kumbaya, we all agree that we're together now, but to clear a space for our own ability to be fertile and human, right? I mean, am I on the right track with what you were saying, Willie, or did I catch something there?
It's possible. I mean, I am just like totally off the cuff. I'm just freestyling.
Right.
Thoughts come to mind, I say them, try to analyze them as I hear them come out of my mouth.
Sure.
But I also think about the act of asking somebody for something is an act of submission.
Wait a minute. Clear that up for me. The act of asking somebody is an act of submission. Go
Yes, you're giving that person power when you ask them for something. Now, I'm sure there are a couple of tracks on how to be revolutionary, but you put yourself in the submissive in second place when you begin to ask somebody else to give you something. Like we're asking for equality.
Right.
Who's in charge? I mean, we live in a world created by a higher power that we can't even imagine. That's the real power. So, and I know this is maybe ridiculous, but somehow just asking for equality just seems insane to me sometimes. We're born equal.
Right.
Our task is to prove it, not to ask for it. And we prove it by, we're all proving it now. You are all sophisticated, intelligent, educated people of color. So you will have an experience that will or will not or will give you the illusion of equality. But you're not asking for it. You're being it. I listen to a lot of mind building tapes. I take a lot of seminars and classes. And I remember one guy saying that, it's not about asking, it's not about wishing, it's just about being.
Right. So we have to inhabit the space.
Yes.
They always say about, the popular maxim is, be the whatever you're looking for, but I like the idea of inhabiting that space, recognizing it.
It's also related to fake it till you make it. That's kind of the same thing from different point of view.
Right. Well, we are fast approaching within the last minute of our communion of ideas. Forgive me, but I was raised the only Catholic in my family, and I never really bought into the wafer as much as I bought into the idea that the church is not a place; it's a people. You know, and this to me is sacred. All conversation is sacred. I've always been. Willie can confirm this. I really love to argue, but I'm never really that interested in winning, because I like to engage other people's intellect, and I am actually genuinely thrilled when Willie and people on this panel and several people that are with us for this salon, when they bring something to me that gives me an opportunity to revisit my own thinking, because if I can't do that, I can't ask that of others. And I want to inhabit the space of deep gratitude, deep gratitude for all three of you, for the lives you've lived, for your own acts of radical forgiveness, for your willingness to come and share them and empower other people to understand that even the deepest, darkest psychological, physiological, spiritual, cultural wounds will leave a scar, but they shouldn't be a hurdle to moving forward into our better selves, and that our better selves are the examples that will empower others to follow suit. So Delita Martin, I adore you. Thank you so much. Charles, my little brother, and my brother, Willie, my big brother, and my brother, and Claudia, my little sister who's helping me do this, and Jim Petrucci, and Jim Toya, and Ben Walmer, and several other people who've checked in. Thank you very much for joining us for this basic nourishment and exchange of ideas for this glass of sugar and water. It ain't lemonade, we're not Beyonce, we're just dealing with what's there for us to drink so we can get on to the next thing. Well, thank you. God bless you all. All good things. Please stay safe. And you have our love and our gratitude. Take care, everyone.